In the fall of 1854, 37 people vanished without a trace on the roads leading into Millbrook, Connecticut, and not a single body was ever found. At first, the authorities blamed Wolves highwaymen, even the brutal winter that came soon after. But the truth was far more sinister than anyone dared to imagine. For over 100 years, the town elders kept a terrible secret, a secret that began with the Hartwell brothers' grist mill on Copper Creek. Every single one of the missing had been seen heading toward that mill, a place where the massive grinding stones turned day and night, even when no grain was brought in to be milled. And before we delve into the story of the Hartwell brothers and the cursed legacy of their mill, let me ask you this: are you listening alone? Because what you are about to hear will make you grateful if you're not. If you're ready for a tale that chills to the bone, you might want to subscribe and tell me where you're listening from in the comments. This story begins on a misty morning, when young Timothy Phelps made a discovery that would expose the darkest secret in Connecticut's industrial history. Millbrook in the 1850s was everything hopeful about New England. Tucked into the rolling hills of northwestern Connecticut, it had a population of nearly 800 farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and their families carving a life from rocky soil and fast-running streams. A main street lined with neat clapboard houses and gardens full of hollyhocks and roses. A white-steepled church whose bell echoed across the valley every Sunday. The town thrived on its industry: 3 sawmills for the forests, 2 tanneries whose sharp scent clung to the air, a blacksmith who worked from dawn to dusk, and above all else, the Hartwell brothers' grist mill, which had been feeding the surrounding communities since 1832. Farmers brought their wagons heavy with grain and left with sacks of flour that sustained 3 counties. The mill itself stood like a fortress, where Copper Creek cut through a narrow gorge, a 4-story structure of weathered timber and stone, its giant 24-foot water wheel turning with such steady rhythm that people joked you could set your watch by it. The sound of the grinding stones rumbled across the valley, as much a part of life as birdsong or wind in the trees. Inside gears, the size of wagon wheels, spun power from the creek. Leather belts drove sifters and cleaners, and the air hung thick with the smell of fresh ground wheat clinging to clothes and hair. The mill's prized French burr stones, bought at great cost, could cut far longer than local granite. It was built by Solomon Hartwell, a God-fearing man who loaned, labored, and built it with his own hands, a man who closed on Sundays, read the Bible, and served the community. His stern-eyed portrait still hung in the office. But where Solomon was a man of faith and generosity, his sons Josiah and Elias were of a different breed entirely. Josiah Hartwell, at 43, was a towering figure, 6'3", even in his stockings. A man who had to duck through most doorways in Millbrook. Broad-shouldered and strong as an ox, with hands that could crush like iron and cold gray eyes the color of wet slate, he cut an imposing presence. His black hair was already streaked with premature gray, always slicked back with pomade, and he ran the mill's business with an iron will. Prices were negotiated with ruthless precision, accounts balanced down to the penny, and debts collected with a relentlessness that made even the wealthiest farmers tread carefully. More than one man had seen an entire season's harvest taken over a $5 debt. His younger brother Elias, 6 years his junior, was the opposite in form and temperament, thin as a rail, with quick, restless hands that never seemed to be still. While Josiah handled people, Elias handled machines. He knew every gear, belt, and stone in that mill as though it were part of his own body, and he had an uncanny knack for keeping the great mechanisms running smooth as glass. Obsessed with mechanical improvements, he scribbled ideas for gears and ratios on scraps of paper barn walls, even the inside of his shirt cuffs. For a brief time, he had studied at the Sheffield Scientific School. But their father's death pulled him back to Millbrook, where all of his schooling went into the relentless perfection of the mill's machinery. Neither brother had ever married. Folks said they were married to the mill instead, and while no one dared say it to their faces, the gossip held that Josiah once courted a fine girl from Hartford who fled back to the city after seeing those glacial gray eyes up close. Elias, for his part, never showed the slightest interest in anything that didn't have gears or required grease. They lived together in the weathered Greek revival house their father built on a rise above the mill. Its once proud white columns yellowed by time, and its gardens choked with brambles. They rarely mingled with the townsfolk. Each Thursday precisely at 2, Josiah walked into town for supplies at Brewster's General Store boots, thudding in a steady, unhurried cadence, offering only curt nods to those who greeted him. Elias almost never left the mill, and when he did, his quick darting steps and restless gaze gave the impression that he was constantly calculating the strain on every building around him. For all their strangeness, the Hartwell brothers were indispensable. The mill employed 12 men, directly millwrights, grain handlers, and teamsters, and supported dozens of families indirectly. The valley's farmers depended on it to turn their grain into flour, and merchants and bakers trusted its output, famed for being fine white and consistent with orders reaching as far as Providence and New York. The summer of 1854 had been a prosperous one. Wheat fields rippled gold across the hills, corn stood tall, and apple trees hung heavy with promise. The town's 4th of July celebration was the grandest in years, with fireworks hauled up from Hartford and a brass band from Waterbury filling the air with music. Progress seemed to be on every lip. The railway was expected to come by. 1856. New markets for their grain lay ahead. Funds had been set aside for a new schoolhouse, and even a respected Boston doctor was considering settling in Millbrook. Life in the town ran like clockwork, as tightly woven as a quilt. Everyone knew everyone's business, from the mayor's gout to the widow Henderson's whispered letters to a traveling salesman. The ladies sewed for the poor. The temperance rallies came and went, and young couples courted under watchful eyes at church socials and barn dances. The seasons shaped everything: sowing, tending, reaping, and the long snowy months when the mill's stones never stopped turning. Yet, beneath all this industry and neighborly order, old whispers lingered. The oldest families remembered tales from their grandparents about the bend in Copper Creek, where the Hartwell Mill now stood, a place the Mohegan people once shunned, saying that on certain nights the water ran backwards. There were stories of strange lights in the gorge during the dark of the moon, and of sounds that did not belong to the creek or the wind. Most dismissed them, now relics of a less enlightened time, but the whispers never quite died. Sometimes on foggy nights, when the mill wheel turned and the stones ground endlessly, even the most practical and level-headed folks of Millbrook would walk a little faster as they passed by. By the fall of 1854, with the leaves turning from green to gold and scarlet, something in the town began to feel wrong. It started with strangers, a rare sight in a place where every face and family line was known for 3 generations. These weren't peddlers or wandering musicians, but solitary figures who appeared and then disappeared, leaving nothing behind but questions. The first was a peddler named Jacob Morse. No one thought much of it at first. He came through on September 15th with a wagon full of tin goods and patent remedies, just like he always did. Mary Wadsworth at the boarding house remembered him because he tried to sell her a tonic for her husband's rheumatism and mentioned he was heading to the Hartwell Mill before dark to see if the brothers needed oil for their machinery. She told him they weren't fond of peddlers, but he just laughed and went anyway. 3 days later, his wagon was found 2 miles north of town on an old logging road. His horse was still harnessed and grazing the wagon untouched cash box still full. Nothing taken. But Jacob was gone. The only odd thing was the layer of fresh ground flour dusting the wagon and horse, as if someone had poured a sack of meal over everything. A week later, it happened again. Thomas Griswold, 22, from Copper Falls, had been courting Alice Putnam, the minister's daughter. On the night of September 22nd, he left her house around 8, promising to return the next Sunday. The quickest way home was the creek path past the Hartwell Mill. Alice begged him to take the main road, but he laughed and said the moon was bright, he wasn't a child afraid of the dark, and he'd save half an hour. Thomas never made it back. His family searched for 3 days before finding only his hat tangled in brambles near the mill's tail race, the water channel that carried the creek after it turned the wheel. No blood, no footprints, just the hat, and more of that ghostly flour dust sprinkled on the leaves like snow. Then a traveling photographer named Clarence Hooker vanished while documenting Mills for a Hartford newspaper. After him came the Shermans, a married couple heading home from New Haven, disappearing on the same night without a trace. By then, the whispers in Millbrook grew into uneasy murmurings. Constable Rufus Baldwin, a careful man and a veteran of the Mexican War, began to see a pattern. On a map of the valley, every mark he made for each disappearance sat near the same place, the Hartwell Mill. Always between dusk and dawn. Always that strange dust. On October 3rd, he rode to the mill. The stones were already grinding, the rumble of them shaking the ground beneath his boots. Inside, he found Josiah Hartwell in the office, bent over his ledgers. The man looked up, his gray eyes calm, his voice flat as stone. "Afternoon, Rufus," he said. "You've come about the missing folks, I expect." Baldwin nodded. 5 people gone in 3 weeks, Josiah. All last seen near here. Dangerous roads, Josiah said, never looking up from his figures, especially after dark. Creeks running high. A man could slip, get swept away, end up in Long Island Sound before anyone noticed. Bodies would catch somewhere, Baldwin said. Josiah's pencil paused for a heartbeat. Not always. Currents get tricky near the gorge. Baldwin held his gaze, searching for a crack in that mask, fear, guilt, anything, but found nothing. "Mind if I take a look around?" he asked. "Mills are dangerous for folks who don't know them," Josiah said, still writing. "Wouldn't want the law getting hurt. Elias doesn't like strangers near the machinery." "I'll be careful," Baldwin said. Josiah shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just stay off the grinding floor while the stones are running." And as Baldwin turned to leave, Josiah's flat voice followed him. "And Rufus, you might want to solve these disappearances quick. Bad for business, all this talk. People might start taking their grain elsewhere." Baldwin spent 2 hours searching every corner of the mill, finding nothing but sacks of grain barrels of flour and the ceaseless turning of the massive millstones that seemed to grind with a hunger of their own. Elias hovered in the shadows, never speaking, his nervous hands flitting over levers and valves, while his unblinking eyes tracked Baldwin's every move. And there was something about that stare that made the constable's skin crawl. It wasn't until he was about to leave that Baldwin noticed something that made his blood run cold. The huge French burr stones, each weighing more than a ton, were grinding empty. No grain poured from the hopper above. just stone against stone, throwing a fine ghostly dust into the air. "Why are you running empty stones?" Baldwin asked. Elias appeared beside him, like a ghost, his mouth twitching into a strange half-smile. Cleaning, he whispered, his voice as thin as wind in dead leaves. "Got to keep them sharp. Got to keep them hungry." That night, unsettled and unable to shake the feeling of dread, Baldwin climbed the hill above the mill and hid himself among the pines. He told his wife he was investigating a prowler near Widow Davenport's house. But in truth, he wanted to see what the Hartwell Mill looked like after dark. What he saw made him question everything. The mill's wheel never stopped turning, and its stones never fell silent, which was not unusual during the harvest, but the traffic was. Between midnight and 3 o'clock, 3 covered wagons came silently down the road. No lanterns, no talk moving, as if they'd done it many times before. Each wagon went in full canvas, bowed under heavy loads, and came out an hour later empty. Then, just after 3, something happened that left Baldwin shaking. By the end of October 37, souls had vanished. The town of Millbrook had changed. No one traveled alone. Farmers moved in groups, rifles slung over their shoulders. The stagecoach hired an extra guard. Doors were bolted at sunset, lanterns left burning till dawn. The Hartwell Mill ground on heedless. Reverend Ezra Putnam called for prayer and fasting, while the most superstitious left offerings of corn, cakes, and tobacco at the old Indian marker stone by the creek, a practice not seen since the troubles of 1793. But most simply stayed away from the mill road after dark. It was a boy, 16-year-old Timothy Phelps, who finally learned the truth, though he nearly lost his life for it. Timothy, son of the town blacksmith, had more curiosity than caution and a stubborn fondness for Jenny Lockwood, whose family farm lay across the creek from the mill. Forbidden by his parents to visit her after the disappearances began, he usually took the long way around. But on the fog-choked night of October 28th, with the valley smothered in gray, Timothy decided the shorter path past the mill was safe enough. After all, who would see him in a fog like this? He was wrong. The fog deadened every sound, turning the world into a dim, muffled dream, except for the steady splash of the water wheel and the deep, slow growl of the millstones. Then he heard other sounds, low voices, the scrape of something heavy being dragged. Heart pounding, Timothy crept closer, drawn by the glow of lamplight spilling from the loading dock. Through the mist, he saw them. The Hartwell brothers bent over a wagon. But the bundles they unloaded weren't grain sacks. They were too long, too soft, wrapped in canvas. One slipped from Elias's grip and fell with a sickening thud. The canvas tore and an arm slid free. Pale and stiff fingers splayed like broken twigs. Timothy made a sound, maybe a gasp, maybe a sob. Josiah's head snapped up, those gray eyes scanning the fog. "Someone's watching," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "The fog's thick," Elias whispered, but his hands had stilled. "No one travels on a night like this." "Someone is," Josiah said. Timothy didn't wait. He ran. Through brambles and mud, tearing his clothes, scratching his face, expecting every step to feel those iron hands on his neck. He ran until he burst into the smithy and collapsed, gasping and sobbing. The story he told would have been dismissed as a nightmare if not for his torn clothing, his bleeding scratches, and the scrap of blood-stained canvas clenched in his hand. Samuel Phelps was a practical man, but a father first. He barred the door, loaded his rifle, and sat through the night with his terrified son. At first light, Timothy was sent to Baldwin, while Samuel galloped to Hartford to fetch the county sheriff. By noon, a posse of 20 armed men surrounded the Hartwell Mill just as Josiah stepped out on his way to the store. He looked at the rifles pointed his way with calm detachment. "Gentlemen," he said to, "what do I owe this visit?" Sheriff Cornelius Wadsworth stepped forward. "Josiah Hartwell, you and your brother are under arrest on suspicion of murder." "Murder?" Josiah's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Who am I supposed to have murdered?" "We'll start with the 37 people who've gone missing these past weeks." "Missing people aren't murdered people, Sheriff." "Show me a body." "We intend to," Wadsworth said grimly, "starting with a search of your mill." For the first time, something flickered in Josiah's eyes. Not fear, but calculation. "You have a warrant, don't need one." "This many missing folks gives me cause to search every building in the county." Josiah's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. "Elias won't like strangers touching his machinery." "Then he'd better cooperate," Wadsworth said. What they found in the lower levels of the mill defied all comprehension. The grinding room seemed ordinary enough at first glance, with its massive stones turning slowly, and the air thick with grain dust, but Constable Baldwin remembered his earlier visit and checked the hopper only to find it empty, while the stones still spun. Sheriff Wadsworth ordered them to stop the wheel, and from the stairs, Elias' eyes darting and hands twitching, whispered that he could not and would not, because the stones must feed threatening that stopping them would break them. Only when Josiah nodded did Elias throw the lever, and the mill fell silent, the sudden quiet almost painful after the constant rumble. Then the sheriff ordered the runner stone raised. The brothers exchanged a look that made Baldwin's blood run cold. Josiah told them the stone weighed nearly 2 tons and would need special equipment to lift, but Wadsworth simply said to get started. For 3 hours they worked the chains and pulleys, and as the massive runner stone finally lifted, an awful stench filled the room, sweet and rotten, like spoiled meat mixed with old grain. Men gagged and stumbled outside to retch. Beneath the stone lay something no one could have imagined. The stationary bedstone had been altered. Its grooves cut deeper to form channels leading to a central hole, and caught in those grooves, ground into the stone itself, were fragments that turned stomachs, splinters of bone teeth, bits of cloth, a crushed wedding ring, a cracked pocket watch frozen at 3:17. The chute below led into the foundation, and when they broke through to follow it, they found chambers carved into the bedrock. Some were empty. Others held the evidence of horrors beyond counting. Sheriff Wadsworth's official report later confirmed remains of at least 43 people, flesh stripped away, bones stacked like cordwood in the deeper chambers, some ground to powder in the mill above. And on the walls, scratched into the stone by Elias's nervous hand, were tallies and names and dates going back 20 years to 1834, just 2 years after the brothers had inherited the mill. 2 decades of murder. 2 decades of grinding human bones into flour. The arrest of the Hartwell brothers shocked not only Millbrook, but the entire region. Newspapers from Boston to Philadelphia carried the story, calling them the Millbrook cannibals, though no proof of cannibalism was ever found. Under questioning, the brothers' story came out in pieces like shards of glass. It began, Josiah claimed, with an accident. In the winter of 1834, a drifter broke into the office to rob them. Elias surprised him, and in the struggle the man fell down the stairs, breaking his neck. "They should have reported it," Josiah said in his flat, emotionless voice. But they were in debt and desperate. Elias, thinking of the terrible winter of 1816, when people ground anything into flour, to survive acorns, chestnuts, even dried fish, said bones could be ground just the same. Protein was protein, and why waste what could be used? Just that once Josiah said to survive the winter. And no one would know. The stones would grind anything to dust. But one time became habit. The flour from their mill became renowned for its whiteness, its fineness, its quality. Orders grew, profits soared, and the brothers found themselves needing more raw material. They chose their victims carefully, drifters, peddlers, strangers no one would come looking for. For 20 years, they took just enough to keep their stones fed without drawing attention. But in 1854, Elias lost control. According to Josiah, he became obsessed, insisting the stones were always hungry, demanding they be fed more often. The rash of disappearances was his doing. For him, it became a kind of machinery, a puzzle of efficiency, the transformation of a human body into components with nothing wasted. Investigators found his journals 3 volumes of detailed calculations and notes written in his cramped, meticulous hand, documenting processing times, bone-to-flour ratios, optimal grinding speeds, all with the detachment of an engineer. The most terrible discovery came from the ledgers. By cross-referencing dates, they realized shipments of this special flour, enriched with ground bone, had been sold across the valley. For 20 years, the people of Millbrook and the surrounding towns had been eating bread made with the remains of the missing. The trial of the Hartwell brothers became the most notorious case in Connecticut's history. Crowds flocked to the courthouse, in Hartford vendors selling miniature millstones and bags of pure flour outside, while newspapers printed every detail. Josiah remained eerily calm, answering in that same flat voice, only showing interest when the machinery of the mill was mentioned. He seemed unable to understand why anyone would be outraged, seeing what they had done as a grim but practical solution to debt and survival. Elias, torn away from his beloved machines, sank quickly into madness, his fingers twitching in the air, as if still adjusting invisible levers, whispering about feed rates and stone balance. By the time the trial began, he was judged unfit and sent to the Connecticut hospital for the insane. The prosecution's case was devastating. Timothy Phelps told the court what he had seen on that foggy night, and Constable Baldwin recounted every detail of his investigation and the slow-growing suspicion that had led to the terrible discovery. During the trial, a line of grieving relatives came forward to identify the objects recovered from the mill's underground chambers. Rings, watches, buttons, scraps of clothing. Silent proof of those who would never come home. But it was the testimony of Dr. Marcus Davenport of Yale Medical College that froze the jury. After studying the remains, he declared that these were no random killings. This was a process industrial murder executed with the precision of a factory. Human bodies, he said, had been reduced to parts and components with the same mechanical efficiency as wheat being ground into flour. I have seen war, he told the court. I have dissected the dead by the thousands, but I have never seen human beings turned into inventory. The defense argued desperation. Josiah's lawyer painted the brothers as victims of poverty, driven to madness by debt and the fear of losing their family legacy. He insisted they had never killed for pleasure or revenge, only out of necessity. It was an argument no one wanted to hear. On December 15, 1854, after only 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict guilty on 43 counts of murder. Josiah Hartwell was sentenced to hang. But the story did not end in the courtroom. In the weeks after the trial, a new horror took root in Millbrook. The townspeople turned to their flour barrels and asked terrible questions. Was this batch made before the arrests? Had they already eaten the dead? With no way to know, some families burned everything they had. Others tried to return their flour only to be refused by merchants who were as terrified as they were. Businesses collapsed overnight. Bakeries closed. Grain rotted unsold in barns. Rumors spread that perhaps all mills did what the Hartwells had done. And then came the sickness. People throughout the valley began to complain of stomach pains, of strange nightmares. A woman in Copper Falls swore she could taste blood in her morning bread. A Millbrook child insisted there were pieces of bone in his porridge, though the bowl contained nothing but oats. Dr. Davenport returned to investigate and found no evidence of poison. But in his notes he wrote, "They have learned they were unwitting cannibals. That horror has poisoned not only their bodies, but their minds." Even so, there were things hysteria could not explain. The Hartwell Mill, locked and sealed by court order, came alive at night. Neighbors saw lights moving across its windows. The water wheel, bolted in place, was discovered turning as though powered by a ghost current. Most unsettling of all travelers swore they could hear the deep, steady rumble of the grinding stones, the sound that once kept time for the whole valley. Sheriff Baldwin, now the town's chief lawman, investigated these reports himself. He found no sign of intruders. Yet on the grinding room floor, there it was, a fine coating of fresh flour dust, as if the stones had been running moments before. The runner stone was still locked in its raised position, exactly as it had been left. The council, desperate to erase the town's shame, voted to demolish the mill at once, rather than wait for spring. On a bitter January morning, the demolition crew arrived and found a nightmare waiting. Elias Hartwell was there. He had escaped the asylum 3 days earlier, barefoot, half-starved, dressed in rags. No one knew how he had made it 50 miles through the snow. Now he stood at the heart of the mill, caressing the machinery with raw, bleeding hands, whispering to the stones like a priest at an altar. "Can't stop," he said when Sheriff Baldwin leveled a gun at him. "The stones are hungry. They have always been hungry. Father knew, Josiah knew, and you'll know too." Somehow, with the water gates shut and the wheel chained, Elias had brought the great stones to life. They spun in the empty hopper, spewing pale dust into the air. Baldwin shouted for him to step away. Elias turned, and Baldwin saw that whatever sanity had once been in those eyes was long gone. Fever bright and cracked with madness, Elias whispered, "Do you know what we found, Sheriff? Stones, remember? Every grain, every kernel, every bone. They remember the taste, and once they've tasted, they never stop. You can't starve stones that have drunk so deep." Then, laughing like a machine gone mad, he turned back to the levers. The mill roared. The stones spun faster and faster, the entire building trembling. The air turned white with choking dust. There was a deafening crack, a sound like thunder, and a blinding flash of light. When the dust cleared, the room was empty. Elias Hartwell was gone. Not escaped. Gone. That was the word people used, because when the dust cleared, there was no sign of Elias Hartwell, except a spatter of blood on the bedstone, and the shredded rags of his asylum clothes, torn as if dragged into the very mechanism of the mill. But that was impossible. The gap between those stones was no wider than a man's thumb. No body could pass through. Sheriff Baldwin ordered the mill sealed again with heavy iron bars across every door and guards posted day and night, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. By the next dawn, word of Elias's impossible disappearance had traveled farther than the valley, wrapping itself in whispers of something that went beyond murder. Millbrook descended into a fever of fear. And then came the waiting for January 20th, 1855, the day set for the hanging of Josiah Hartwell. The town changed as the date drew near. It was as if the coming execution hung over everything like a storm that had yet to break. Even the air felt thick with dread. Animals refused to drink from Copper Creek. Horses shied and stamped when led too close. Mechanical failures plagued every mill in the county. Stones, cracked in half wheels, froze mid-turn gears, stripped their teeth like they were chewing bone. Children all over the valley woke screaming from the same nightmare that they were kernels of wheat tumbling helplessly into the waiting mouth of a millstone that ground with a sound that was not sound, but laughter. In Hartford, behind the cold stone walls of his cell, Josiah Hartwell waited. He seemed immune to the January chill. His nights were sleepless. Guards found him always awake, scratching diagrams on the walls in charcoal, sketching out designs for new milling machines with the same detached precision he'd once applied to the dead. Every cog, every wheel, every stress point carefully noted. Every drawing a plan to make the stones faster, sharper, hungrier. He ate his meals as if by formula, chewing each bite 20 times before swallowing like a machine designed to consume. Reverend Putnam visited him to offer prayer, but Josiah only listened politely, and when the minister faltered, asked whether the Reverend knew the ideal moisture content of stored grain. 14%, Josiah said, without waiting for an answer. Too dry and it shatters. Too wet and it molds. Everything has its perfect state for processing, Reverend. Everything. Even the most hardened men in the jail avoided him. They whispered of nightmares just from sleeping near him, of the sound of stones turning in their dreams. 3 days before the hanging, something broke. Sheriff Baldwin was making his rounds when he heard something he had never heard before. Laughter. Not Elias's mad shrieking, but Josiah's deep, rolling laughter, a sound so genuine it made Baldwin's skin crawl. It was the laugh of a man who suddenly understands something no one else ever could. Sheriff Josiah said from behind the bars, and his voice for the first time carried warmth. Come closer. There's something I need to tell you. Something important. Against every instinct, Baldwin stepped closer. The lamplight flickered on the walls, making the charcoal diagrams twist and shift. Josiah leaned forward so close his breath misted on the iron bars. It smelled faintly, impossibly, like fresh flour. You think you understand? Josiah whispered, gray eyes bright. You think this was about money? About desperation? You think we killed them? Baldwin felt his hand tighten on the butt of his pistol. Josiah smiled, and the smile was worse than any threat. His teeth gleamed white and unnaturally even, like they had been ground smooth. We never killed anyone, Sheriff. Not once. We processed them. We ground them. We sold them. But the killing, that was never necessary. Baldwin's mouth went dry. What are you saying? Josiah's voice dropped to a low, measured murmur that seemed to fill the whole corridor. The mill, Sheriff. The mill's older than Millbrook, older than Connecticut, older than anything. The Indians knew. They called that place where the earth eats. They stayed away. My father knew too. He fought it for years. Fought it until it took him. You're insane, Baldwin said, but his voice cracked. Josiah tilted his head almost kindly. Am I? Then explain, Elias. Explain how a barefoot man traveled 50 miles in the snow. Explain why the stones turned with no water. Explain why every mill in this valley is breaking apart now. You think locking us up ends this? You can't stop hunger by chaining the mouths that feed it. He leaned forward until Baldwin could see nothing but those pupils wide and black swallowing the gray. The mill is still there, Sheriff, and it is still hungry. Do you want to know the real secret, Sheriff? Josiah asked, his voice low and steady, and against every instinct that screamed to flee, Baldwin found himself nodding. Do you want to know why the flour was so fine, so white, so perfect? The stones don't just grind grain, Sheriff. They grind everything. They grind past and present memory and flesh, hope and bone. They take what is and strip it down to what can be used. And when you feed them long enough, when you give them something richer than wheat, they teach you things. They show you patterns hidden in the sound of grinding, the mathematics of reduction, the beauty of absolute efficiency. The beauty, Baldwin whispered before he could stop himself. Oh yes, said Josiah. There is beauty in waste becoming resource, in the complex transformed into the simple. Every person who went into those stones became part of something greater. Their calcium built stronger bones in the valley. Their protein fed children their iron, enriched blood. They did not die, Sheriff. They were transformed. They were utilized. Is that not a kind of immortality? Baldwin stumbled back, fumbling for the door, and Josiah's soft, patient laughter followed him. Not loud, but deep, like the sound of stones grinding in the far distance. That night, Baldwin could not go home. By candlelight, he searched the archives in the sheriff's office, looking for the truth he suddenly feared. Again and again, the same spot on Copper Creek surfaced in old records, always with disappearances and misfortune. In 1657, the Weatherby family vanished, leaving their meal half-eaten on the table. In 1691, Obadiah Morse built the first mill there, and within a year he and his family were gone. Their mill found running empty, the stones worn glass smooth. In 1703, William Brewster tried to claim the land, and lasted one winter before abandoning it, raving that the creek whispered at night. He died 3 months later, dreaming of stones. Even the death of Solomon Hartwell in 1832 no longer seemed an accident. The coroner's report described a crushed body, but in the margins, almost too faint to read, was a note body showed abrasions and striations consistent with grinding. How this occurred when the mill was not in motion remains unexplained. The morning of January 20th, 1855, dawned gray and cruelly cold. Ice crystals hung in the still air, and the gallows stood pale and raw in the yard of Hartford jail. Despite the cold, 300 people gathered in silence, more like mourners at a funeral than a crowd for a hanging. They clutched crucifixes, prayer beads, iron charms, sprigs of rowan. At precisely 7:45, the doors opened, and Josiah Hartwell stepped out between two guards. Those who saw him swore he seemed larger, as though he carried more space than one body could hold. His prison clothes hung loose, but he walked barefoot, and the frost steamed beneath his feet. Step by step, he crossed the yard, and some swore they heard the slow grinding of stones beneath each measured pace. On the scaffold, the Boston hangman waited, his hands shaking as Josiah ducked to fit beneath the beam. The sheriff asked if he had any last words. Josiah looked out over the crowd, with those slate-gray eyes, calm and patient, the eyes of a man watching grain pour into a hopper. "You think this ends with me," he said. "You think the hunger dies when the feeder is gone. But the stones remember. They remember every grain, every bone, every life they have tasted. They will stand silent, but they will not be still. And when the hunger grows too great, when emptiness gnaws at them, someone will come. Someone always comes because efficiency calls to those who can hear it." In the silence that followed every person in the yard, heard it, the faint distant rumble of something deep beneath the earth, like great stones beginning to turn. "Utilization sings to those who can hear it," Josiah said, "and the grinding never ends." He smiled, then a slow, terrible smile that changed his face into something that seemed less than human and more than man. When the hangman reached for the hood, Josiah refused it. "No," he said, "let them see, let them remember. Let them know what watches and waits and hungers in the dark." At exactly 8 o'clock, the trap was sprung, and Josiah Hartwell dropped the rope, snapping taut with a sound like a stone breaking. At that same instant, every mill in the valley, every single one from Hartford to the Massachusetts border, suddenly roared to life. In Colchester, the Browning Mill's frozen wheel began to spin as though the sluice gates had opened. In Warehouse Point, stones that had been pulled apart for cleaning slammed together and began grinding. All across the valley, the sound rose, a deafening, hungry roar that drove people into the streets, pressing their hands to their ears. At the chained and boarded Hartwell Mill, the guards swore the entire building shook like an earthquake. The wheel, despite its iron restraints, spun so fast it threw a geyser of icy spray 100 feet into the air, as if the frozen creek had suddenly turned to a raging flood. Inside, they said the noise was like the earth itself was screaming, and like 1,000 mouths chewing at once. Windows shattered outward, the great doors burst open, and a cold white light, not firelight, but something pale like moonlight, filtered through flour dust, poured out into the fog. And then, as abruptly as it began, everything stopped. The prison clock struck 8:01. Every mill fell silent. Wheels froze, stones stopped. The sudden quiet was so absolute it seemed the entire valley was holding its breath. On the gallows, Josiah's body hung limp. But in those final seconds, witnesses swore they saw something impossible. The corpse seemed to shrink, to collapse inward, as if something essential was being pulled out of it. When they cut him down, the body weighed half of what it should. And the undertaker reported the flesh felt wrong, gritty, almost granular, as though it had already begun to be ground. That afternoon, Baldwin rode to the Hartwell Mill. The guards were gone, not dead, simply gone. Their rifles leaned against the walls, their footprints led to the threshold and ended. Inside the mill was spotless. Every surface was clean, the gears and belts oiled, the massive grinding stones polished smooth as mirrors. On the floor of the grinding room, carved deep into the planks, in letters 3 feet high, was a single word: hungry. Baldwin ordered the mill sealed this time with bricks instead of boards, every entrance closed. But as he stood there in that clean, silent room, he knew it was useless. The mill had tasted something richer than grain. That taste would never fade. And from deep beneath the floor, from a depth no basement could reach, came a sound that made Baldwin run without looking back, the slow, steady rumble of stones, turning, waiting, patient and hungry. In the days after Josiah's execution, the final search of the mill uncovered something older and far more terrible than anyone expected. Beneath the foundation, far below the chambers where the processed remains had been found, lay a chamber that was not colonial at all, but far older. Its walls were built of great fitted stones, slick with age and carved with symbols worn nearly smooth. Dr. Davenport called in again for his knowledge of ancient cultures, identified them as pre-Columbian. At the center of this chamber sat a single massive disk of granite, not a millstone, but something like one carved with spiraling grooves that led inward to a hole so deep it seemed bottomless. Around it lay offerings of corn and tobacco, and bones, animal bones and human bones. This is why they built here, Davenport wrote in his report. The Hartwells did not bring evil to this place. They were drawn to it, called to it. The mill was only a modern expression of something much older, a hunger that has been in this ground for centuries, maybe for thousands of years. The council, faced with this knowledge, made a decision that would haunt them for generations. They chose not to destroy the mill. Instead, they bricked it up entirely, sealing every door and window. The water wheel was dismantled and broken to pieces. And they prayed that this hunger so old it had no name would sleep. But hunger always wakes. The millstones were shattered with sledgehammers, and the fragments carried out to the deepest parts of Long Island Sound, scattered where no one would ever find them. The ancient chamber beneath the mill was filled with cement load after load, until the men swore there was no more room to pour. Then Copper Creek was forced from its course, its waters diverted, so they no longer touched the mill. The building, stripped of its power, became a hollow shell, standing like a gravestone in the woods, and the forest began to reclaim it. Millbrook itself never recovered. Within 5 years, most of the families had left, unable to live under the weight of memory and shame. The railway bypassed the town entirely, the prosperity they had once dreamed of passing them by. By 1870, Millbrook was little more than a fading name on old maps. Its houses empty and its remaining mills silent. But stories have a way of surviving. Travelers spoke of strange sounds on fog-bound nights, a faint grinding as if stones still turned somewhere deep in the valley. Hunters avoided the creek, saying their dogs would refuse to approach the ruins. And every few years, someone disappeared on those old back roads, leaving behind only their wagon or their pack and a fine dusting of something pale that might have been flour. Timothy Phelps, the boy who first exposed the Hartwell horror, lived to the age of 87. On his deathbed in 1923, he pulled his grandson close and whispered, "Stay away from mills, boy. Stay away from old stones and old hungers. Some things, once they get a taste, they never stop being hungry." The Hartwells knew that. God helped them, they knew, and they fed it anyway. Fed it until it owned them body and soul. He died clutching a handful of wheat kernels, as if even in that final moment he needed to remember the difference between grain and what else might be ground to dust. The Hartwell Mill still stands, though hidden now by the forest. Trees grow through its windows, vines crawl up its walls, and Copper Creek, despite all efforts to change its course, has found its way back to run beside those sealed foundations. On certain nights when the fog is heavy, locals say you can hear it, the deep, steady rumble of stones turning grinding. Grinding, always grinding. In 1954, exactly 100 years after the arrests, a New York developer bought the land intending to clear it for houses. The bulldozer died less than 50 feet from the mill. Every machine brought near suffered the same fate, engines seizing gears, locking as though the metal itself had turned to stone. The project was abandoned, and the land eventually donated to the state as a nature preserve. With one condition: the mill is never to be disturbed. Official maps mark it as unsafe closed to the public, and those who know the true history are glad. Because some hungers do not sleep. They wait. Patient as stone, waiting for someone foolish enough to feed them again. And so this story leaves us with a question. Are the most terrifying monsters the ones shaped by greed, desperation, and human hands? Or is there something older, hidden deep in the earth that waits for the willing? What do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, ring the bell, and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. And remember, sometimes what we fear in the dark is nothing compared to what we should fear in the light.